Curtis Delgado, please bring in King County Prosecutor Dan Satterberg.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, and welcome to the Morning Update Show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's good to be here. This is actually Prosecutor Satterberg's first time with us live. Yeah. We've done some pre-recorded stuff, so it's first time live. Next time we got to get you in the studio, though.
That'll be a good thing when we start to get out and do more in studio things. But yeah, it's good to be with you, and I'm sorry to be reporting on such a negative story.
Well, you know, it's an important story. When we tighten it up there we go. It's an important story to be talking about what's going on here. And actually, unfortunately, the last time that we talked was about this very same issue. And let's before we jump into the actual the information that you guys put out there to the public, man, why don't you tell us, like, what's going on?
Well, what is going on, and there's a lot of remarkable things happening in the criminal justice system right now. But while we're digging out from a pandemic-related backlog, and while we have a whole lot of new work to do to resentence people for crimes that they were convicted of, and we had the drug statute thrown out by the Supreme Court back in March. That's 50 years worth of convictions that we are undoing, and in addition to some other cases that we're resentencing. So there's a lot going on, but what's really going on in the community that we're tracking, and we have been tracking for the last 4.5 years, is a really disturbing rise in the incidence of gun violence and gun homicides as well. So the reason my office keeps track of this is that we're sort of the one place that can be the repository from about 40 different law enforcement agencies that we work with. And so we have kind of a baseline going back to 2017 about what so-called normal gun violence was pre-pandemic. And then last year, when we started to get into this lockdown about a year ago, we saw a rise in gun violence. And then that has continued in a disturbing fashion through 2021. So when we compare we count these things. We count the number of incidents where a gun has been used, and that could be a car or a house gets shot up or a street sign or something, and we can recover casings from a scene like that, all the way up to people being shot and hit, and then those that die, and then those that do not die. All those are different categories that we keep track of. What we know from the first half of 2021 is that our incidence of just any sort of gun being used is up by 33%. The incident of someone being struck by a bullet is up 60%. Number of people being killed by guns is up by 50% over this 4.5-year average.
Right. So let's jump into some of these slides here. The first one that we have is shots fired.
So yeah, that will tell you that compared to the numbers we've been keeping since 2017, we're seeing far more incidents of shots fired. That's up 1/3. The number of people hit is up over 60%. The number of people killed over 48%. So yeah, that's kind of our top line data that we keep. But we also track where it's happening, and then we have other information that we don't share involving who is more likely to be involved.
So, and speaking of, and I know Trey wants to jump in a second, but when you said where it's happening, I want to put up the second slide here, which is the areas, the geography.
So you can see it's happening everywhere, but most of it is now not happening in the city of Seattle. 64% of the shots fired, almost 60% of the people who were hit are happening outside of the city limits of Seattle. We've seen the migration of violence into the suburbs over the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah. And when you get data like this and you're able to kind of map it out and showcase really what's going on, what are some of the biggest takeaways from your office thus far in terms of those first 2 slides we just showed?
Well, just that we've had this sense that there's a lot more gun violence out there, and this confirms that. And within my office, I have a team of deputy prosecutors who respond to every homicide scene. So anytime the police find a dead body or there's a shooting and somebody might die, then we go out to that, and it could be any time, day or night. Typically, we do about 90 of those a year. We call the team's called MDOP, the Most Dangerous Offender Project. Typically 90 call outs, we call them every year, where police will call us because they've discovered a deceased person. Well, last year we had 146, and in the first half of this year we had 90, and we've had 8 in the last 5 days. So it's, there's a lot more violence, and we measure it in terms of the workload on our people, but that's really a callous way to do it. We know that every time somebody is shot, it's a terrible tragedy, and that there's ripples of grief. Their life may be forever changed. I mean, we shouldn't discount people who are just injured by guns, because that can be a devastating, life-changing injury. And of course, anytime someone is killed, there's ripples of grief that go throughout the community. So we have to stop and acknowledge this is not just a workload issue. This is a human tragedy. This is trauma that's rippling through our community. And every time one of these happens, it seems like there's some sort of act of retaliatory violence. Well, that creates even more exponential suffering.
It's really good to hear you say that, Prosecutor Satterberg, that you mentioned these ripples and the ripples of grief and everything else. Sometimes in our fair city here, we get a lack of empathy or a lack of understanding from people in leadership positions that, it's of course the victim and the victim's family, but it's a lot of times the whole community or neighborhood or people who eyewitnessed these horrible acts. They're impacted. So we've got a historical data slide here we'll put up right now.
So this just shows you the number of shots fired on the left of the screen, and then the number of shooting victims. So they're both up in the first half of 2021, and up quite a lot. And so then the question sometimes comes, well, why? I don't know that I have the answer to why. It's complicated. I'll say this, it's happening all over the United States. We are seeing more and more violence in every major city, and even in rural areas as well. Obviously, the availability of firearms is a key part of this. It just, anytime you've got more guns, and every year we've seen record numbers of gun sales, and anytime you have them in the area, it can take an angry confrontation and make it a deadly confrontation if one or more people involved have a gun on them. And so often we see somebody pull out a gun in the middle of an angry confrontation, thinking, if I pull out a gun, that'll calm everything down. Well, obviously it has the opposite.
We've seen a lot of shoot. I mean, what I've noticed is a lot of shootouts. And, growing up here back in the day, a lot of stuff with guns was one way. And you're right. Somebody would pull out a gun. Somebody say gun, everybody runs. You know what I'm saying? But we see like up there on Capitol Hill on Pike and Broadway, there was a shootout, 25 show. People are shooting at each other, right. Which is crazy. One more slide here. And I know that Trey, we got a few more questions for you, but this one is a breakdown of race.
And this, sadly, is not news. This is a pretty consistent demographic breakout where we've seen for the last 4.5 years that we've been keeping these statistics. Obviously, this is a guy thing. 85% of the people who were shot were men, and mostly young men under the age of 24, and people of color, and particularly Black African-American victims represent half of the people who were shot in the last 6 months in King County. So this shows the high concentration of deadly gun violence within communities of color.
Yeah, this is, something that I think is really felt by families. And when you talk about this being, really a human issue, it's clear that, many families are the ones dealing with this. In terms of your role in all of this, understanding these numbers, and I appreciate your first answer to my question. Now, when you start to break it down by race, what does that mean, or how does that change it? Because we also know that there's been kind of a history of, Black folks getting the hammer slammed at them when it comes to these kind of things. How are you guys looking at it from an equitable lens?
Well, that's a great question. And it does fall disproportionately upon young people, young men of color. And I think that one strategy that is called out for is to invest in the kind of violence interruption programs that we know have worked around the country. And we have some people in our community. We're lucky to have people who run programs like Community Passageways and Choose 180 and others who are willing to work with young people who are attracted to violence. And, you know, they have to battle this thought that some young people in our community have because they live in violent areas that they think, I can't leave the house unless I have a gun with me because there are people out to shoot me. And that's not an irrational thought for some people in some situations, but it does lead to the use of more guns and you know, the sort of endless cycle of retaliation when one group shoots at another group. So the violence interrupters and the investment in these really, we call them credible messengers, people who have a lot more credibility than I do, or some judge. It's somebody who's had lived experience who can surround a young person and say, you know, there's more that you can do with your life, and we're going to work with you to get a job, or maybe to move out of this neighborhood to a different neighborhood, or we'll show you some new experiences. But it's about developing trusted relationships between adults and young people, where then they can start to move them away from the thought that they have to have a gun with them all the time.
Right. And maybe you could do this, sir, is you could explain, and last time I talked to you, you talked about why the investment. We talked about Choose 180 last time we talked, but you talked about why investment was important, because this isn't just like a social work job. These violence disruptors and programs. I mean, and I think paraphrasing at the time, it's like, this is dangerous work what people are doing. And when I talked to Derek Wheeler Smith, a ZYD, and Coach Davis from Community Passageways, you know, one of the main things that they were hitting on is that this is also a form of public safety. I only bring that up because I think like the general public, when they hear peacekeepers and they hear credible messengers, they're kind of thinking like, oh, are these kind of just some social work people, not disregarding that industry, of course, but maybe you can speak more to this role and why investment clearly that you're behind is important.
And these investments in both the city and the county announced a $2 million new investment in the groups that are willing to work with young people who are most likely to be involved in violence. And it's hard, you know, most groups, Boys and Girls Clubs, love them, but they don't want to work with kids with guns. And, you know, it takes an individual relationship that's built between the credible messenger and the individual. And one of the things that we do with the information that comes to my office that we don't release all of it publicly, because some of it is about individuals who happen to be in and around scenes where people are being shot. And maybe they haven't been shot yet, or maybe they haven't been charged with a crime yet, but they are in and around the scenes. And we do something called the social network analysis. So we know if your friend's been shot, you know, if you know someone who's been shot, you're much more likely to be shot yourself. So if you're in and around that violence, those names bubble up into our database. We share those names with the violence interrupter groups that are willing to do this work. And not to say that you have to report back to us on anything. We just say, here's the names of some people who we think statistically are likely to be caught up in violence. Go work with them. And we don't want you to report back to us on anything, but we just want to tell you who we think it would be worth targeting as a resource, as a positive role model in their life to try to change the direction that they seem to be headed in. So this is really hard work. It has to be targeted to the people who are most likely to be involved in violence for it to have any impact. And it's not going to be successful all the time, but it is definitely worth doing, and it's definitely worth investing.
Yeah, absolutely it is. And you know, one of the graphics that we showed just now also really showcased how this violence is erupting all throughout the city, throughout the county. What are some of the things that you think we can do to ensure that folks who think this isn't their issue, right, that it's not hitting their doorstep or the propensity of it to hit their doorstep, what are some of the things that you think we can actually do to make sure that they begin to care about this issue and really see it as a public health crisis?
Well, getting people to care about it when it is concentrated in communities of poverty and communities of color, that is something that these statistics are designed to help people understand this is our issue. And some people are moved by the humanity and moved by the fact these are young people. These are our kids who are ended up shot and killed. Others may be moved by the fact that there's an economic price, right? We all pay a huge price for gunshot victims, whether you live or die. There's enormous financial expenses that go, and if we can prevent a homicide, and the studies show that we save millions of dollars for every homicide that's prevented. So some people are moved by the economic arguments, others just by the fact that these are our kids here in King County, Washington. This is a big problem all over the country. I want to stress that, but it isn't enough to say, well, then we shouldn't worry about it because this happens everywhere. It's happening right here in our neighborhoods, and those bullets are flying, and innocent people get hit too. And we just shouldn't tolerate an increase in gun violence as okay or normal or a consequence of the pandemic. Frankly, it's a consequence of the pandemic. I didn't anticipate that we would see so much more violence, but I think violence is at its core, it is an emotional response to despair. And so we have to be able to surround the people who are most likely to think that violence will help them get out of the desperate situation they're in, and give them some other alternatives. It has to not just be all carrot, it has to be some, it can't just be all stick, it has to be some carrot. You have to say, we're going to help you get out of this because we're going to help you get a job, and we're going to help you move into a better neighborhood, or we're going to show you, even some of these targeted groups, they'll take young people out hiking in the mountains. They've never been there. They've never been out of their neighborhood. So, establish trust relationships with adults. That is a proven approach to this. And it's something that we have to invest in the community. Only the community can bring that sort of justice to the streets.
Right. One last question for you. All right. I'll throw this out here. And I appreciate you going overtime with us. But this is a very important topic, especially for our community. We actually have some parents that are in the chat right now, and parents who've lost their children to gun violence here in the city of Seattle and across King County. Man, I know your office, the police does a lot of the investigative stuff. Your office does some as well. But just to the parents who are actually watching right now on here with the King County Prosecutor, do you have any words for them?
Well, first of all, I'm sorry. It is the hardest thing that any parent could do would be lose a child in any fashion. And to lose a child to senseless gun violence has got to be the hardest thing ever. And I've met with a lot of families who've suffered this, and it's irrevocable. It is grief that won't go away, and it's shared every day. There's new members of this club that nobody wants to belong to. Someone who lost a loved one to gun violence. We need to stand up and say this is not okay, and we need to start working on the areas that where we can give hope to young people, so they don't think that they're destined to just carry guns and just shoot at other people. And that is an entire community conversation, but it starts with having some trusted members of the community step in to places where nobody else wants to go right now. And we definitely need more community liaisons and violence interrupters, particularly in our Latinx community and with the children of recent immigrants. And there's a lot of areas that we haven't been able to reach into as a community. But the parents who've lost children, that should be our motivating factor to do better and to not just respond. That's what my office, unfortunately, mostly we respond after a tragedy. We hold people accountable. We take cases to trial and do the things that prosecutors do. But so much of this work has to be before all of that happens. It really has to start with young people, children in elementary school, to teach them how to de-escalate themselves. We talk about de-escalation for police, and that's really important. But we all need to understand that violence and anger is a neurochemical response. This actual cortisol that's going through the brain, and it's making people feel like it's a fight or flight syndrome. And if they've got a gun, then all of a sudden this tense and angry moment becomes a deadly confrontational moment. So we need to teach us all how to step away, how to walk away from a situation like that, and learn to live another day. So it's heartbreaking, and I'm so sorry that people are suffering this and continue to suffer it. And like I say, we've had over the last weekend, another 5-6 homicides that have happened, and it's preventable and it's reversible. It's irreversible, but it's something that we should be concerned about as a public health issue. And you hear that said all the time, that the gun violence is a public health issue. Well, it is because it's preventable. In the same way that COVID can be prevented by a vaccine, gun violence can be prevented by investments in the communities where this is disproportionately tearing apart families and destroying lives.
Yeah. Right on. King County Prosecutor Satterberg, I want to thank you for taking time with us this morning, for taking time out of your schedule, because we wanted to actually have a real in-depth conversation. Thanks for getting the information out there, and hopefully we can keep this discussion going.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good one.
Bye.
Man, so the one thing about this, the data gives a lot of insight, and what he was talking about, I talked to him about that last time, is that everybody's tracking all this data, whether it's over there at the prosecutor, whether it's up at Harborview, whether it's public health, ZYD, and they're able to target in. And I'm telling you that the actual number of people, there's some stuff that's just random, totally random. But a lot of this violence that impacts our community, man, it's a relatively small number of people, and it all touches. And what he said, though, is true of what the data says. If you know somebody who's been shot, it raises the chances of you yourself being shot.
Yeah, this is exactly the work that's been happening on the ground, and from a community perspective as well, is identifying the potential young folks who may be involved in these acts of violence. And I remember being startled hearing these numbers, and hearing that it boils down to maybe like 50 people, right? And there's this very serious nucleus of folks that are involved. It's insane, man.